The shooting range. In this episode, Pages of History, the American Tank Diet, Tactics and Strategy, Tips and Recommendations on Using Radar Systems, and Metal Beasts, the one with the heaviest caliber in War Thunder. The Admiral Graf Spee is a German heavy cruiser that entered the ports of our players with the release of Update 1.95. They also called it a pocket battleship, and not for nothing. Despite the relatively small displacement, its main caliber isn't inferior to battleships in terms of firepower. The cruiser's main armament consists of 6 28cm guns, evidenced by 3 in each of the 2 turrets. By the way, at the moment, this is the largest caliber you will find in the whole game. On the sides there are auxiliary caliber weapons, a total of 8 150mm barrels. On the stern and both sides, the designers also installed 3 powerful 105mm twin-mounted AA guns. And then there is a motley variety of 20mm and 37mm autocannons, as well as 2 4-barrel torpedo tubes in the stern of the ship. The cruiser is driven by a diesel power plant, accelerating it to more than 28 knots. In battle, the Admiral Graf Spee primarily relies on the devastating power of the main caliber. The fire rate is low, and the number of guns is small, so you can't suppress the enemy with continuous fire. But what you've got is HE rounds that can reward you for each direct hit, since they can destroy any enemy ship. As for the armor-piercing ones, in most cases they will even be too powerful to use. As of now, there's not a single ship in War Thunder that has thick enough armor to hold a punch from one of these. At close range, the fire rate becomes almost as important as the damage. That means that the auxiliary caliber guns come into play as well, and it's important to remember to alternate them with the main caliber ones. And don't let the word auxiliary mislead you. 150mm is a serious number, comparable to main caliber weapons of some light cruisers. They also have a decent fire rate, allowing you to make 3 or even 4 shots while the weapons of the main caliber are reloading. To summarize, that is, without a doubt, one of the most heavily armed ships in the game to date. Not the most armored by any means, but it's important to remember. The cruiser's armor can withstand HE and a semi-armor piercing rounds, but a single successful AP one can send you back to the hangar if it hits your ammo. Torpedoes pose an even greater threat. The large dimensions of the ship make it difficult to effectively evade them, and its speed is also not very suitable for quick maneuvers. The Admiral Graf Spee loves a careful play. Its main task is to live in battle as long as it's possible in order to fully realize its fire potential and manage to drown more heavy enemy ships. There is a persistent stereotype that the Soviet tank industry was creating machines with good weapons and strong armor, but not too heavy, well, relatively, while the Americans were more and more drawn to huge 3-meter-high profiles. And in many ways this is true, but there were exceptions. And there was at least one time when American engineers also demonstrated to the world their ability to optimize designs by creating a series of compact models. That's the one we'll be talking about today. Overall, the end of the war was a controversial time for the American tank industry. Machines were becoming more and more powerful, and with the growth of caliber and armor, the mass was predictably increasing as well. The latest heavy tank, the T-34, not to be confused with the famous Soviet namesake, weighed more than 65 tons. Even the monstrous T-95 didn't look so massive compared to that one. It became clear that design ideology was at an impasse, and it was time for some radical tank diet. Very much like Soviet engineers, the Americans figured out that the weight can be diminished with the reduction of the under-armor hull volume. But they went in a completely different direction. First of all, they developed new power units with powerful tank engines having very compact transmissions. They turned out to be much shorter. Control system also took a step forward. Now the driver could control the tank with just 2 pedals and 1 lever. Driving a tank more and more resembled playing on a joystick, and eventually became so simple and intuitive that there was no need to have an assistant driver anymore. What was so useful about the compactness of the power plant? Take, for example, the good old Pershing, with an engine of 500 horsepower. A new power unit of the same power was twice as light and a third shorter. This made it possible to significantly reduce and lighten the tank itself, or not reduce anything but replace the engine with an 800 horsepower one, getting much higher mobility. And this is the way the M46 pattern was brought into existence. Inspired by the opportunities that this approach opened up, the Americans launched a new program in 1946, developing 3 tanks at once: the light T-41, the medium T-42, and the heavy T-43. This light tank was created to replace the obsolete Chaffee. It was refined and introduced into service under a new name. Today, we know it as the M41 Bulldog, and although it still gained 5 tons relative to its predecessor, it also got a 500 horsepower engine, so it still came out pretty nimble. The heavy T-43 tank, later known as the M103, became a complete analog of the T-34, but 10 tons lighter. Using it as an example, the designers experimented with cast elliptical cases, relying on angles and clever geometry instead of the armor's absolute thickness, and the prospects looked very promising. Meanwhile, the Korean War began. The Americans had nothing better than the pattern in stock, and the need for new tanks was very urgent. As a result, the T-43 went into production long before it was perfected, and it took several years to fix it completely. But in the end, the military still got roughly what they expected, albeit with a fair delay. On the other hand, the T-42 medium tank got completely unlucky. In fact, it was a heavier version of the Bulldog with a 90mm weapon. The same bet on a compact power unit looked promising. The tank was almost 10 tons lighter than the Pershing, but it had similar weapons and armor. But the same Korean War buried this project. There was no time for fine-tuning. So the Americans acted in the simplest manner. They took the turret from the T-42 and installed it on the usual pattern, while also strengthening the frontal armor. Thus, they created the M47 Pattern II. How can we summarize this chaotic period of the history of the American tank industry? The designers of that time started an ambitious project, a whole line of new tanks, unified as well. History remembers a lot of cases where such undertakings would fail with a deafening crash. But not this time. The military did get new machines, even though not quite as they'd intended to. In the comments, you often ask us for tips on how to effectively play on anti-aircraft guns with radar. This topic is a bit too extensive for the hotline, so we've decided to carefully analyze it in the Tactics and Strategy section. We've already talked about the basics of radar systems shortly after we introduced this mechanic into the game. If you missed it, take a look at episode 139 of The Shooting Range. And here we'll talk about rational tactical use and typical mistakes that often prevent players from maximizing their team's benefits. Let's start by choosing our position. At the beginning of the battle, SPAA gunners prefer to stay on their home turf. Indeed, why travel around the map at the risk of running into enemy ground forces when the effective radius of radar systems allows you to control a huge section of the sky without all this fuss? There is some logic here, but there's also a fatal flaw. Because an SPAA with a radar is one of the most hunted targets on the map, and the respawn point is the most obvious place to look for it. Sure, a helicopter with a thermal sight won't always distinguish your silhouette, but hey, what's that? Some piece of tech still standing on the enemy base? What else can it be besides an SPAA? That's right, pretty much nothing. Such behavior will give you away in no time. Instead, it's best to slowly move along the map, keeping close to your allies. That way, it'll be much harder to detect you from the air, and you'll find it a lot easier to cover your teammates. The main thing is not to rush headlong ahead of the Allied forces. Otherwise, you'll just give an easy frag to one of the enemy tankers. Moving on, don't keep the radar on constantly, especially if you've only cannon weapons installed. That way, you'll just scare the target away before it's in range. Instead, try activating the radar for a short time. Turn it on, examine the horizon, turn it off. This will be enough to prevent you from being taken aback by a cunning opponent flying around the map at low altitude. The exception here would be the British Stormer, which has an optical location system, so the radar warning receivers installed on many helicopters won't respond to it. The same is true for missile carriers. Yes, one of this class's key features is having a radar, which gives them a huge advantage in their fight against air targets, but it doesn't always make sense to turn it on. The reason is the same. You don't want to unmask yourself ahead of time. After all, it's often not at all necessary to lock onto the target. You can get things done with a manually controlled missile, and there are two valuable reasons to do so. Firstly, this approach will allow you not to disclose your position until the very moment of launch. And secondly, it'll be convenient when firing at helicopters hovering near the ground. As you know, at low altitudes, radar works noticeably worse due to strong interference, but it doesn't affect manual missile control. A competent game on SPAAs with radar represents a stealthy hunt in which your own camouflage is almost more important than constant airspace monitoring. The more you're able to catch the enemy by surprise, the more frags you will have on your account by the end of the battle. And now it's time to answer some of your questions that you ask in the comments. The first question was sent by a player called Mr. Moby Dixon. Any chance we can get searchlights for our ships? Would be cool to see searchlights in night battles looking for planes. Oh, that would look marvelous indeed. We'll definitely pass it on to the dev team, but can't make any promises though. Reynolds Jacob 12 asks, what is the fastest biplane in the game? Hi there. Our pick would be the Japanese Ki-10. Its low weight, perfect propelling plant, carefully handled aerodynamic surfaces, and intricately shaped wings designed for high-speed limits all combined to make it one of the fastest planes of its class. As for the second place, we'd say there would be a serious competition for it between the Soviet I-153 Chaika and the Italian Fiat CR-42 Falco. Then there is a question sent by Mies Duet Games. Will we ever get World War I tanks? Hello there. The years go by, but we still don't plan on introducing any World War I tech. Dead Snake War has another question. Can the devs please make a page of history on the Ruikat? Thanks for the suggestion. This is indeed a really interesting and unusual machine. We'll think about it. And the last message for today was written by Neon Leon. Any chance of getting standalone versions of Pages of History? Hi. We like Pages of History very much as well. But for us, they feel like home exactly as they are right now, as part of the shooting range. Well, that's your lot for today. You've been watching The Shooting Range by Gaijin Entertainment. So come on, people. Subscribe. Use your radar to locate and click that bell and leave a like, because I asked you to. And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. We want them and need them. See you on The Shooting Range next week.